Hey guys, so I am going to walk you guys through my process of thinking about and drawing landscapes. Kind of like what you guys see here. Here in Louisiana, we don't really have mountains, we don't really have canyons, we have a lot of swamp and we have a lot of trees, but I'm gonna do my best to break it down and make it easy for you to understand. We're gonna talk about atmospheric perspective. We're going to talk about breaking an image down into the foreground, middle ground, and background. So foreground would be like this gravel, middle ground would be like that levee, background would be like those trees. And I am going to show you how to sketch, how to marker, and how to watercolor a landscape. So I need to teach a class on drawing landscapes, which is something I am just historically not great at. Comic artist, I can do backgrounds, but I don't draw a lot of landscapes. So I figured, since I'm going to be out in the countryside today, that we could practice doing some landscapes where there's actually some landscapes. All right, so this is the view that I'm going to be drawing. It's a tractor shed with a tractor in it and some trees behind it. So in some of my past tutorials, we've talked about atmospheric perspective. We've talked about 1-point and 2-point perspective. Today, I'm keeping it really loose. I'm just kind of doing a study. So I am going to mostly be relying on atmospheric perspective when rendering our landscape. And I'm going to be working in color pencil. And by that, I just mean one color of color pencil. It's just a sketch. I don't know yet if I want to do some watercolor landscapes with you guys. We're just kind of feeling things out. I had to be out here anyway, so I thought I would take advantage of the situation. So one of the first things we're going to need to do is we're going to need to determine what kind of composition we want, and we're going to also need to determine the horizon line. Basically, the horizon line is if we could look all the way out into the distance, we would see where the curve of the earth ends. But basically, you can just kind of make it your eye line for what you're looking at. I don't do a lot of in-person sketching anymore because it requires, setup. I usually work from photos, so this could be a little bit different for me, a little unusual. We may see a secondary tractor pop up. We're just doing some farm work out here. So what I'm really going to be focusing on today for this landscape is capturing the tractor shed and capturing the tractor and maybe getting a hint of the grass and the trees as well. For these field studies, I'm going to start by creating my composition first and then roughly block in the horizon line as well as block in the shed that I'm drawing in the distance. And then I'm going to start roughly blocking in the objects that are inside the shed. I didn't like how that one was turning out. I felt like I focused too much on the shed and had made the shed too large. So I'm going to try again. Blocking out the shed, this time not bothering to rough out a composition. I'm going to treat the whole page like my composition, and I'm roughing out the objects that I see. So the bushes, the tractor, everything is really loose and blocky. And once I have everything kind of roughed out, I can start adding in more details. I'm just trying to keep this a fairly loose sketch, and I'm going to do all my underdrawing in red and then tighten up the details in blue so that you guys can see them better. This is the sort of thing that the more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. I'm very out of practice with drawing landscapes and environments, but I used to bring a small sketchbook around and just kind of doodle corners of waiting room, doodle stacks of magazines, that sort of small atmospheric filler to stay in practice. once everything is roughly blocked in, I'm going to turn it over and use the blue pencil and kind of, I'm not quite ink it, right? But pencil over it again so you guys can actually see the details that I want to keep. I'm going to refine it using the blue pencil. And I'm trying to kind of keep how I'm handling the foliage kind of loose, kind of gestural, but so that you can kind of still get the idea of what I'm going for. When tightening the sketch up, I worked from foreground, so the area closest to the viewer, to background, and that way I don't have to worry about things overlapping in a way that's confusing to you guys. This will kind of allow us to solidify the overlap. And overlap is something that you want because it's going to help give a sense of distance, and it's going to give a sense of scale. By having one object in front of the other, you're actually creating a visual hierarchy, rather than if you had everything kind of spread out and nothing was overlapping anything else. So that's a trick to give things a little bit more depth and a little bit more distance, is to add in some overlap. Even something like foliage, like grass, like leaves, like bushes, can really help push the idea of there being distance. Now, since I am out of practice and since my brother was still bush hogging, I decided to draw this dilapidated trailer in the distance as well. Why not? So this way we can get a little bit of perspective. This is 2-point perspective. That would be what the trailer would be in. I'm just going to freehand it here since this is a sketchbook sketch and I'm not really aiming for perfection. I'm really just practicing capturing what I'm seeing and translating it to the paper, taking art three-dimensional, because I was here doing plein air sketching, and taking what I see in real life and translating it to a two-dimensional field is actually very challenging for me. So I was practicing that skill while also applying the elements of horizon line and overlap, scale, and also trying to make sure that I included the necessary details while omitting some details. So something to keep in mind that I sometimes struggle to remember is that objects in the distance are going to have fewer details, things are going to be hazier, whereas objects closer to us are going to have sharper delineations and more details. So again, I'm kind of blocking everything in before I go over it again with blue pencil. And I'm using the whole page this time, and I'm making sure to include some taller grasses closer to the viewer, again, so that we can really work on creating that sense of scale and creating that sense of depth. something that I normally don't do, and that is I'm going to share some of one of my classes with you guys. So this is something I normally would share on Patreon, and I'm going to share this to my Patreon again for people who have joined me since 2009. This was created when I was teaching at Community Ed in Nashville. I was teaching a class on making comics and zines, and this is the class on creating environments and backgrounds. And I'm going to skip some of the materials that I actually covered in this because it's not really relevant to us talking about landscapes today. Now, my focus with this environments class, or this section on environments, was environments for comics, and it was mostly interiors because that's what most of my students would be drawing at the time. This class that I'm teaching coming up is actually on going outside and drawing landscapes, but there's some elements that still apply, such as, you know, the ability to work from reference, whether you're sitting there and looking at your reference or you're working from photos. Some people who paint landscapes work from photos. And when I was teaching this class, I was really heavily encouraging them to work from reference, but also to consider the environment and who it's serving and who might decorate it. Again, focusing a lot on the interior. So we talked about in this class perspective. I think I taught them 1-point and 2-point perspective. What I want to focus on regarding landscapes is actually atmospheric perspective, and that's one of the reasons I pulled this up. I also have some tutorials here on YouTube on atmospheric perspective, both for drawing and in watercolor, that I highly recommend you check out. I think I did a really good job with those, even though those are older. I will link those down in the description as well. However, even if you're mostly relying on atmospheric perspective rather than linear perspective, I think knowing some elements of linear perspective is important, such as the horizon line, the vanishing point, and creating a perspective grid. But I feel like atmospheric perspective is kind of the easier one to pick up. It's more kind of common sense. And if you're not a math-minded person, atmospheric perspective might be a little bit easier for you to grok. So we're going to talk about how color saturation decreases with distance. Objects in the distance get gray, blue, or purple, kind of depending on the color palette that you're using. The contrast decreases with the distance. That's why it's harder to see details. The brightness increases with distance, so it gets lighter, hazier. It's not as distinct. Edges remain sharp even in the distance, but fog and heat can cause some blurring. These properties are still relevant at night, although what I would recommend is going mainly monochromatic at light, with maybe just some of the lights being in color. It's also still relevant underwater. And then you have aerial perspective, like heavy fog, heat shimmering, rain, etc. And you can apply all of these principles even if you're working with a perspective grid and doing linear perspective. So something we need to think about when we're doing landscapes is we need to think about the foreground. That is the area closest to the viewer and has the most detail. The middle ground, and then the background, that's the furthest from the viewer with the least amount of detail. We need to think about overlap. Objects overlapping one another are going to give us a sense of scale. The object that overlaps the other one or is in front of the other is going to appear closer to the viewer. We need to think about scale. That's how things are in relation to one another. The size, like trees and mountains versus like a hen in the distance, right? We also need to think about proportion. So again, just kind of keeping things relative to one another. These are things that can really help give a viewer a sense of the environment that they're looking at. That's why if you live in an area that has mountains or has like a lot of gradations in the terrain, it can be easier to create believable landscapes. Whereas living here in Louisiana, if you look at some of the Louisiana landscapes, it's swamps with not a lot of background and not a lot of distance and not necessarily a lot of the tools that we might use in atmospheric perspective to convey depth and to convey distance. So this is an example that I created years ago as just a quick explainer. I actually recorded and shared it here on YouTube, but you guys can see, like, in the foreground, that's the plane closest to the viewer. The flowers are really large. You can see little insects. The tree is also really large, taking up a good amount of the environment. And then on the next plane, the trees are quite a bit smaller and there's a river running through. And then on the next plane, the trees are even tinier and the animals are even tinier and the river is smaller. And then there is a mountain all the way in the background overlapping some of the clouds. And there's even some teeny tiny trees on the mountain. And then behind that, there is a sun. And this is a really sketchy and messy version, but I do think it really kind of conveys some of the basic principles in a really quick and easy to understand way. So what I want to focus on is landscapes. We've already gone out into the field and done some practice sketch landscapes. Now I want to sit in my studio and work from a reference and maybe try to apply some of the properties of linear perspective and atmospheric perspective to what I'm drawing. So I'm cheating a little bit. I've got my reference photo probably right there. I may move it so you guys can see what I'm drawing and still see the reference photo. But I also have my list of the elements that I'm looking for when it comes to atmospheric perspective already pulled up to remind me so that we can talk about these as we're covering them. When I went out and I sketched like live for you guys, I was just drawing what I was seeing. I wasn't necessarily thinking about the elements of atmospheric perspective, but I do think that's something that's important to bring into this. They're very useful, and it's something that when we're drawing landscapes, we should be mindful of, and I just don't do it often enough anymore for it to be at the top of my head. So I'm going to try and make sure that it's at the top of my head today. So first of all, I am going to kind of bound out my composition. I'm also going to put down a composition grid, and I actually have tutorials where I've talked about all of these things. I'll try to remember to link them for you guys. And this is a pretty central, easy to see composition, right? We can see where the horizon line is. And really, you want to try to make the horizon line either higher or lower than the center of the paper. And when I took the photo, it's at the center of the photo. But I am going to fudge it a little bit and make that horizon line, HL, a little bit lower. The horizon line is the eye line where the horizon, kind of the landscape meets the sky, right? And if you're a short person, you're going to see less of the landscape. If you're a tall person, you're going to see more of the landscape, or more of the landscape is going to fill your view. So we have our lake. It's really a pond. And I'm going to put that lower here in the composition. And then we have that little, it's basically a ditch. It's where the animals come down. And we also have in our foreground, we don't have anything extreme foreground. We may choose to add a tree or something, add some plants for visual interest. That is an option, but we've got a pretty unobscured view. We have the bank of the little pond going up here, and then we have it kind of curling here, and then we have some trees here and some trees here. So those are foreground trees, and I may decide to add another foreground tree in the extreme foreground. We've got some branches here, and we've got some plants here like grass, things like that down here. So this would be the foreground, and then up here, anything kind of not in our immediate vicinity would be the background. So we have the other side of the pond over here, and then it kind of curls because it's kind of like a kidney bean shaped pond. We have some more land over here. We have some trees. We have some trees. Those are shorter trees. And then in our background, we have our taller pine trees, and then we have the sky. And it was kind of a cloudy yet bright day that day, so unfortunately we don't have distinct clouds, but we could add distinct clouds if we want. And we don't have the sun in the shot. We also have, and I don't want to clutter this up too much, a reflection in the pond that we can choose to convey or to not convey. So here is our horizon line. This is where the pond kind of meets the land, or you could even have it a little higher up. It's hard to see because we can't see all the way as far as our eyes can see to the very end of the world where the land touches the sky. We've got trees in the way. It's a Louisiana problem. You can't go 50 feet without having trees. We have our foreground here. It's closest to the viewer. The middle ground, so the pond and the land on the other side of the pond, and then we have our background, the trees on the other side of the pond. So the things closest to us, the viewer, those are going to have the most detail. That might be where we choose to draw the leaves on the trees, whereas the things furthest from the viewer, they're going to be smaller, less distinct. These are going to be more just forms. So I've kind of blocked everything off. Let's start adding in some of the details. And this is just kind of a sketchbooky sketch, right? We're just doing a sketchbook exercise. And I'm working in color pencil because it's easy for you guys to see. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to erase. So if I make a mistake, I'm just going to overdraw it and you're just going to have to ignore it. I may, now that I think about it, do my drawing in the red, and that'll be a little bit easier for me to do my overdrawing. So you can choose to, in my opinion, you can choose to kind of work on refining these details however makes sense to you, however you wish. A little bit of a hill right here, and then we have the mass of the tree, and then this is grass, and this is grass, and you guys can see in the reference that not all the grass looks the same, and you can also see how the pond kind of melds into the ground, right? So actually this pond has gotten some rain, but the water level has decreased, and that's why you have some high areas and some low areas. And we got some grass. And this is a sketchbook sketch, so again, you can choose to add details, you can choose to change details. We don't have to do straight up realism if we don't want to. Just remember that as our grass recedes into the background, you may want it to be smaller and take up less space. We've got several different kinds of trees here, but most of these are pine. And then we have our pond, and it is at a slight angle. So one of the things about drawing naturalistic landscapes without buildings, without boxy sort of shapes, is you can kind of get away with treating it like one-point perspective. So if you're familiar with one-point perspective where everything converges to the center point, you can choose to do it that way. Because we don't have these like boxy shapes to kind of tell the eye really what, you know, what's right and what's wrong. Everything is kind of looser and more organic. You can kind of phone it in, kind of fill it in as you wish. Trying to think about how I want to say these things, because I know anything I say can be held against me. Now I've got the mass in the background, and we've also got a little bit of grass over there, and then it kind of dips down, and we've got another landmass, and it dips down. Over here there's some trees sticking up that are dead trees. And I'm not going for like super tight detail. We also have our background trees. I'm just gonna blob these little deciduous trees out. We want to add some overlap where some of the trees are overlapping each other. If we were doing this in color too, we would also, so the problem with this one in color is this would be the reverse, because when I took the photo, I was standing in the shade just coming out of the trees. And then, so I'm over here, this would actually be darker framed. And the area behind us, or in the background is well lit by the sun. So, because it's a clearing, because it's a pond. So it's kind of the reverse of what you might normally do for atmospheric perspective. So we have kind of these pointy pine tree shapes in the background. It's actually kind of going up a ridge. And unfortunately, we don't have any mountains here. We don't even have any like really tall hills. So everything is kind of on the same plane. Now, something else you guys can't see is this is flat on my desktop. I'm standing so that I can get a good overall view of the composition without it skewing too much, which not the most comfortable way to draw. And then I'm like hunching over and working around my camera mount so I can actually see my reference. So what I might want to do with this, but what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just kind of start again refining some of the details. I'm going to use the blue this time because I kind of lightly sketched everything in red, and hopefully this is enough information. Something else I want to point out is me teaching and talking to you guys actually kind of takes up the same part of my brain that observing and making decisions would take up. So what I'm going to do is I am going to break this into time lapse, and I'm just going to break out a time lapse if I decide to change some things significantly, and I think you guys should know what I'm doing and why. So there's a few things I actually want to do with this now that we've got kind of a nice tight sketch in place. I've kept the shading mostly loose because I think I'm going to pull out my markers and add a little bit of color to this. But I also want to add a couple of extreme foreground elements. And I was just thinking something simple, like a couple of really tall blades of grass in the extreme foreground, just to kind of, you know, pull everything and to kind of, I don't know, frame it a little bit, especially because there's not a lot going on. And these would have to be some really tall blades of grass, I grant you, because they would be entering iframe at this height. But I did want something to demonstrate, you know, extreme foreground, kind of blocking your view of the vista. We could add also in some like tree leaves here and there, maybe to also kind of frame that up, or even some pine needles here and there. But I kind of liked having the sky there. And some of these are tricks from comics for comic storytelling and for like creating a little bit more drama. And this kind of creates like a vignetted viewpoint that kind of frames what's going on here. You don't have to do this. I don't see a lot of landscape artists adding in these kind of extreme foreground things to kind of give that sense of scale and to kind of frame things up. But you know, I gotta bring a little bit of my comic artist expertise in here, right? Gotta justify those degrees. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of pine needle here. And part of this is because I know what kind of forest this is. I know what's in this forest, so I don't mind inventing a little bit because I know that this would be here. And all that does is just add some extreme scale to kind of help us get a sense of how tall, how big those trees are in the background. For example, how far away they are. For example, how tall these pine trees must be in the background, for example. So I'm going to pull out some color and we're going to add just a little bit of color here and there just so I can kind of demonstrate what I was talking about using atmospheric perspective and color. And keep in mind, when I took the photo, I was standing under these trees, so I was in the darkest part and then this part was lit up. But we can also use that for storytelling and framing. We can make this appear special. We can make it appear important by making it a little bit brighter by adjusting that contrast. All right, I think I've got mostly what I need. I'm not really trying to be super color accurate. I'm really more trying to capture the vibes of what I'm seeing than anything else. But these are the colors that I'm going to be using with this. So with the markers, I'm both trying to kind of keep in mind what I'm seeing from the reference, but also keeping in mind elements of atmospheric perspective. So as we talked about earlier, typically objects in the distance would be cooler, bluer, and all closer in saturation, whereas objects in the foreground would be brighter and there would be more discrepancy between saturation, more contrast between shadow and between highlights. But because I'm working from a reference photo and I really did want to capture that feeling of emerging from the woods into a sunlit area, I was kind of trying to balance both of those while also using a limited selection of markers. I really do enjoy doing these kind of simple alcohol marker exercises in my sketchbook though. They're a lot of fun and they really force me to think. This is pretty rough, but I think it conveys the general idea of what I'm trying to convey when we're talking about atmospheric perspective. Towards us, we have generally darker, more saturated colors. They haven't all grayed out. We have more detail. We can see individual blades of grass, for example, or the sticks in the foreground, or the moss along the pond's edge. As we move away from the foreground into the middle ground, we start losing some of the details. Everything becomes a little bit more abstracted, a little bit fuzzier, and we've kind of simplified the shapes quite a bit. Like with the trees, we now have a mass of a tree instead of individual leaves, or instead of like clumps of leaves. And then as we move even further into the background, we don't even have individual trees anymore. We have masses of trees. In general, I'm kind of working somewhat from the photo, but like if you really wanted to push the effect, you might gray out the trees in the background and make them even less distinct and give them even less contrast and even less saturation. Because as we move from the foreground, which is an area of high saturation, high contrast, to the background, which is an area of low contrast, low saturation, and low detail, you do kind of want that like planar shift. I really don't have much footage from teaching the class because I was teaching teenagers and I don't think that would be really appropriate to share with you guys. This is basically what I was drawing, and this is kind of an in-process shot of what I was drawing, and then this is a more finished shot of what I had drawn. To wrap up our on landscapes, I want to give painting a landscape another try. I tried this out with the Alkali Creek Advent Calendar box, and it's not my strong point. I'll I'll definitely say that. We talked earlier about how Louisiana doesn't necessarily have vistas the way, landscape painters like to paint vistas, and I prefer to work from my own reference. So I have some photos that I took while I was in North Carolina, and I'm going to be painting one of those. Now, not super long ago, I tried painting some mini landscapes in this Hahnemühle little accordion book. I did some of these while on vacation, some of these when I came back and had more time to paint, and they are just teeny tiny. And if you're interested in this, I have a video coming up where I talk about this and some other new Hahnemühle products. So I'm kind of trepidatious about this, kind of looking forward to it. We're going to try to take it easy, we're going to take it slow, and we're going to see how it goes. I am going to be using my Da Vinci mixing palette. I feel like this has some good area to start for this. And I also wanted to limit my colors instead of using my big Daily Driver palette, because sometimes I get option paralysis and I'm really not looking to overthink this or overwork this. So I thought this might be a good way to keep things kind of simple. I'm going to do the drawing and painting in time lapse so that I can really focus on what I'm doing. And I may or may not, I don't know, that's a future Becca problem. I may or may not narrate on top of it, kind of depending on what I think needs pointing out. So before we get into this watercolor thing has been time-lapsed quite a bit. So I start out with a sketch in pencil, just trying to sketch it kind of lightly so that it's not really leaning on the line art. I didn't want the line art to distract me from really leaning on the watercolor. That was my goal for doing a landscape study like this. I've seen other artists do it. I wanted to try it. I wanted to see if I could come kind of close. Now, I did tighten up some of the lines once I kind of figured out my foreground, my middle ground, and my background. This was taken while we were on vacation in North Carolina, Murphy, North Carolina. So I had some really lovely reference of mountains to work from. And I really wanted to kind of capture the mistiness, because these are either the Smoky or the Blue Ridge Mountains. We were kind of traveling back, so we may have crossed in between. So I wanted to capture kind of some of the haziness, some of the mistiness, and that might have been part of my problem, is I got a little too loose with this one. I also think I worked a little too saturated from the get-go, and I don't want to just sit here and critique my work for you guys, because the point was this was an exercise. I was doing something that I don't do very often, and I'm trying to learn from it. And I think it succeeded in that goal, and I really think I should be doing more of these if I want to get better at landscapes. But to sit here and just criticize it kind of undermines the purpose of doing studies, which is to learn. So you guys see me using a lot of the water spray. I really wanted to capture that mistiness, and hopefully you guys can kind of see some of my mistakes. Too saturated, too quick, should have pulled back some. This is the second study because I wasn't satisfied with the first. I really wanted to give it another shot. So again, I'm lightly sketching in the background, kind of holding my mechanical pencil to the side, and I didn't tighten this one up as much. So I am reading, I believe it's called Watercolor Rescue. I really like it. I'll try to make sure I include the correct title and a link to it. I think you guys will really like it. It's a bunch of little watercolor tips to help you salvage what you're painting. And one of the tips was about using different blues in the sky and in your water source, and how you should try to use the same blue, and that'll make the painting more cohesive. And I really like that tip. I'm trying to put it into practice more. You guys can kind of see it with this illustration here. I also try to pull back on the saturation from the first one so that we do have that foreground, middle ground, and background, but I'm also trying to replicate the colors that I'm seeing in the photo. And maybe I should try to make it a point to do more plein air painting. Unfortunately, as we talked about earlier, here in Louisiana, we don't exactly have a lot of landscapes, so it may have to wait till vacation. I'd actually originally planned on painting while on vacation, but just didn't get around to it. It wasn't quite the time. This was kind of a struggle for me. I think I've mentioned earlier, Landscapes are not really my strongest point. This is something that I want to get better at because I think it'll improve my storytelling in my comics. And landscapes in watercolor with minimal drawing, and I tried to keep the drawing minimal and let the watercolor do most of the work, is definitely not one of my strong points. This is something that I'm going to need to keep working on and keep practicing if I hope to get any better. But I'm still glad I tried a few different landscapes and that I attempted to paint one from my own photo reference. Sometimes working along with an instructor, whether it's a video instructor or it's an in-person instructor, can make things a little bit easier. Sometimes you feel like you're just rushing to keep up with them the whole time. And sometimes trying to work your way through it and do it yourself can be really challenging and somewhat frustrating, but you can learn a lot from doing it this way. So is drawing landscapes my strong point? No, but it was fun to try it out, and it's definitely an area that I can and should put a little bit more time and a little bit more practice into, especially if I hope to draw expansive and immersive comic pages. Not everything can happen inside a room, right? So today we talked about atmospheric perspective, we talked about the horizon line, we talked about scale and shape and overlap, we did some drawing outside, we did some drawing inside, we worked from in the real world plein air reference, we worked from photo reference, we played around with markers, and we also played around with watercolor. I need to keep practicing my landscapes to get better at it, but I enjoyed this and I enjoyed sharing it with you guys. If you guys are looking for a little bit better instruction on painting landscapes, Alkali Creek has it down pat, and it was working through their advent calendar that kind of inspired me to give this another try and to put a little bit more effort into it. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I have some more sketchbook tutorials for you guys if you guys are looking to pick up some new skills or challenge yourself to draw things you generally don't draw. I hope to see you guys again soon with another art supply review or tutorial like this one here today. And if you like what I do and you want me to be able to continue to do it, you can join me over on Patreon and get early access to videos like this one. You can find me at patreon.com/natosoup. And I did talk about my comic quite a bit. It would mean the world to me if you would head on over to natosoup.com or to 7inchkara.com and check out my webcomic 7-Inch Kara. You can read it for free, or if you'd like to support what I do and own a copy or two for yourself, you can find Volume 1 and Volume 2 in the Nato shop at natosoup.com/shop. That is my own personal shop. I don't have an Etsy. It's natosoup.com/shop. And if you are looking for a wonderful watercolor comic to give to a young artist in your life, I have been told that the hardcover version of Volume 2 makes a great gift. Have a wonderful day, guys. I hope to see you guys soon. Bye. So here are some of the studies, sketches, and illustrations, if you want to call them that, from us taking a focus on drawing landscapes. I think these are great for sketchbooks if you're looking for sketchbook ideas, drawing the world around you. It's full of inspiration. You don't have to come up with anything. It's something I like to do when I'm burnt out or I'm having art block, but I still want to draw, is working from reference. So if you're looking for some inspiration, why not turn to your outside world? Thank you guys so much for joining me. If you like what I do, make sure you subscribe, and I hope to see you guys again soon with another art supply review or tutorial. I do have a bit of a sketchbook series that I will link for you guys. If you enjoyed this, you can find that down in the description below. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.